I'm going to tell you about a memo that could have changed everything. Early March 2001. I was sitting in my office at the CIA's Counterterrorism Center in Langley, Virginia, finishing an assessment that would later haunt me for the rest of my career. Outside my window, other analysts were heading to lunch, moving through their routines like it was just another Tuesday. Inside, I was writing a threat assessment that would be filed away and forgotten until 3,000 Americans were dead. The memo was addressed to senior intelligence leadership. It concerned a pattern of communications intercepts, financial transactions, and movement reports we'd been tracking for 8 months. My assessment was direct and urgent. Al-Qaeda was planning something unprecedented on American soil. Not overseas. Not at an embassy. Here. Home. I wasn't some junior analyst making wild guesses. I'd spent 6 years tracking Islamic extremist networks. I'd been in Nairobi after the embassy bombing in '98. I'd briefed the National Security Council on the USS Cole attack. I knew how these networks operated. I knew their capabilities. And I was watching them pivot toward something bigger than anything they'd attempted before. But here's what made this different from every other threat assessment crossing desks in Washington that spring. I wasn't just warning about a general threat. I had specifics. Flight school enrollments by individuals connected to known extremist facilitators. Financial transfers that made no operational sense unless you were prepositioning for a major operation. Communications intercepts discussing the big wedding and 0 hour. The intelligence community in early 2001 was drowning in threat reporting. Everyone knew something was coming. The question was what, where, and when. My superiors read my assessment the way you'd read your 100th threat report of the month, with professional skepticism and bureaucratic exhaustion. Their response? File it. Monitor the situation. Don't create panic over intercepts that might mean nothing. I'm not here to tell you I predicted exactly what happened on September 11, 2001. I didn't know it would be planes. I didn't know it would be the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. But I knew we were missing something catastrophic, and I knew we were running out of time. This is the story of how America's intelligence apparatus saw the threat coming and convinced itself it wasn't real. How the most powerful intelligence community in history dismissed warnings because they didn't fit our doctrine of how terrorists operated. How we measured Al-Qaeda by our metrics and completely missed that they'd changed the game. And how in the 6 months between my warning and September 11th, the signs were everywhere, if anyone had been willing to see them. To understand how we missed 9/11, you need to understand where American intelligence was in early 2001. We'd just come through the most dominant decade in American military history. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Desert Storm had been a 100-hour victory. Our technology was unmatched. Our intelligence capabilities were the best in the world. We could track a vehicle from space, intercept communications anywhere on the planet, and had networks of sources in every major terrorist organization. The intelligence community's doctrine was built on this dominance. We tracked state actors, nations with governments, militaries, and intelligence services. We understood how wars started. We knew how to monitor threats from China, Russia, rogue states like Iraq and North Korea. Terrorism was a concern, but it was manageable. Embassy bombings were tragic but contained. The USS Cole attack was an outrage but operationally limited. Terrorists attacked soft targets overseas. They didn't have the capability for strategic strikes inside the United States. That's what our analysis told us. That's what history showed us. When I started tracking Al-Qaeda seriously after the East Africa embassy bombings in 1998, most of my colleagues saw it as important but secondary work. The real threats were ballistic missiles, nuclear proliferation, Chinese espionage. Bin Laden was a problem, sure. But he was a problem we understood how to contain. I thought differently. Not because I was smarter, I wasn't, but because I'd been on the ground after the Nairobi bombing. I'd seen what 400 pounds of explosives could do to an embassy. I'd interviewed survivors. I'd read the intelligence on how long Al-Qaeda had spent planning that attack. What struck me wasn't just the violence. It was the patience. These weren't impulsive actors. They planned for years. They adapted. They learned from failures. The USS Cole attack in October 2000 showed they were getting bolder, striking military targets, testing American response. By late 2000, the intelligence chatter was increasing. We were seeing phrases in intercepts that suggested operational planning. Something spectacular kept appearing in communications. References to the big operation and timeline discussions about soon. The CIA's Counterterrorism Center was tracking this. The FBI had field reports about suspicious individuals. The NSA was intercepting communications, but we weren't connecting the pieces. Each agency had fragments of the puzzle, but there was no unified picture. I spent January and February 2001 reviewing everything we had on Al-Qaeda operations in the United States. 36 individuals with suspected Al-Qaeda connections or sympathies. 11 enrolled in flight training programs. Financial transactions that showed money flowing into the country with no clear legitimate purpose. Individually, each piece was explainable. Flight training? Maybe they wanted careers in aviation. Financial transfers? Could be legitimate business. But taken together, the pattern looked like preparation. The doctrine we operated under said terrorists couldn't pull off complex operations inside the United States. Our borders were too secure. Our law enforcement was too good. The operational security required for a major attack was beyond their capabilities. This wasn't Iraq planning Desert Storm. This was a loose network of extremists working from caves in Afghanistan. Every assumption was logical based on historical precedent. Terrorists had never successfully conducted a strategic attack on the American homeland. Our defensive posture had always been adequate. Intelligence sharing, while imperfect, had always been sufficient to catch major plots. I was betting on a threat that hadn't materialized yet, not in the way I was describing. March 2001, I finished my assessment. The core argument was straightforward. Al-Qaeda had shifted from overseas attacks to planning a major operation inside the United States. The timeline suggested late summer or early fall 2001. The target was likely symbolic, financial, governmental, or military. The methodology was unclear, but the operational security and patience suggested something well-planned and devastating. I included 12 specific indicators. Flight school enrollments by individuals with extremist connections. Financial transfers totaling over $500,000 with unclear purpose. Communications intercepts discussing timelines and the wedding. Movement of suspected Al-Qaeda facilitators into and through the United States. Changes in communication patterns suggesting operational security for a pending operation. The sudden departure of several Al-Qaeda family members from the United States. Intelligence from foreign services suggesting a major operation was planned. Historical pattern analysis showing Al-Qaeda typically waited 18 to 24 months between major attacks. We were at 22 months since the USS Cole. My recommendation was equally direct. Increase surveillance on suspected individuals. Coordinate with the FBI to investigate flight school enrollment. Work with FAA to enhance aviation security protocols. Elevate the threat level for potential domestic terrorism. Prepare contingency plans for a major attack on U.S. soil. The assessment went to my division chief, then to the deputy director of the Counterterrorism Center, then to senior leadership at CIA. The response was professional but skeptical. Yes, Al-Qaeda was a threat. Yes, we needed to monitor them closely. But the assessment was speculative. The indicators could have multiple explanations. Creating panic over flight school enrollments would waste resources and potentially reveal our intelligence method. More fundamentally, my superiors questioned whether Al-Qaeda had the capability for what I was suggesting. Conducting a coordinated attack inside the United States required operational sophistication we hadn't seen from terrorist groups. It required bypassing multiple layers of security. It required operational security that historically these networks couldn't maintain. One senior officer told me directly, "You're seeing patterns because you're looking for them. Terrorists overseas are one thing. Strategic attacks here are another. We've never seen it because they can't do it." I wasn't alone in my concerns. FBI field agents were reporting suspicious activity. The NSA had intercepts that troubled their analysts, but each agency was operating in its own lane. The CIA focused on overseas threat. The FBI handled domestic security. The NSA collected signals intelligence. No one was synthesizing it all into a unified threat picture. There was also a bureaucratic reality. Threat assessments were common. We generated dozens every month about potential attacks worldwide. If we elevated every concerning indicator to crisis level, we'd be in perpetual emergency mode. Leadership had to prioritize based on assessed likelihood and potential impact. My assessment was filed with notation: continue monitoring. Report any significant development. No immediate action required. April 2001. I kept tracking. The flight school information bothered me most. These weren't aspiring pilots pursuing careers. They were paying cash for accelerated training on commercial aircraft. They showed minimal interest in takeoff and landing procedures, the hardest parts of flying, but intense focus on in-flight navigation and control. One FBI field agent in Arizona wrote a memo that mirrored my concerns. He'd identified several individuals at flight schools who fit a troubling profile. His memo went to FBI headquarters. It was filed. Another agent in Minneapolis would later arrest Zacarias Moussaoui in August 2001 after a flight school reported his suspicious behavior. He wanted to learn to fly a 747 but didn't want to learn to take off or land. The Minneapolis agent requested a warrant to search Moussaoui's computer. FBI headquarters denied it. Insufficient evidence. May 2001. The CIA's Counterterrorism Center issued a general warning. Bin Laden network's plans are advancing, attacks are approaching. It went to senior leadership. The response was to maintain vigilance but no operational changes. June 2001. The intelligence chatter was increasing. Phrases like 0 hour and the big wedding appeared repeatedly. The NSA was picking up increased communications between known Al-Qaeda members. I wrote an updated assessment. The threat was escalating. The timeline appeared to be narrowing toward late summer. Something was coming. The response from leadership: we're aware. We're monitoring. But we can't elevate threat levels based on vague intercept. We need something specific: a target, a date, a methodology. July 2001. I was increasingly frustrated. The pattern was clear to me, but I couldn't make leadership see it. The doctrine was too strong. Terrorists couldn't pull off strategic attacks inside America. Our defenses were too good. The operational requirements were too complex. An FBI agent connected to our task force said something that stuck with me: we're measuring them by our standards. What if they're not playing our game? Late July 2001. A CIA briefer gave President Bush a presidential daily brief titled, "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S." It mentioned Al-Qaeda's interest in hijacking aircraft. It noted patterns of suspicious activity. The assessment was similar to mine. General warning without specific operational details. The response was similar: Maintain vigilance, continue monitoring. No major policy changes. August 2001. The chatter dropped off. Communications intercepts decreased. To some analysts, this suggested the threat was receding or we'd disrupted their planning. To me, it meant they'd gone operational. When terrorists go quiet, it's usually because they're in the final stages of an operation and maintaining communications security. I wrote another update. The silence was concerning, not reassuring. Something was imminent. My division chief called me into his office. He wasn't dismissive, he was exhausted. We've elevated this to every level of leadership. Everyone knows your concerns. But we can't operate on pattern analysis alone. If you get something specific, a target, a date, bring it immediately. Otherwise, we maintain current posture. I left that meeting knowing we were wrong, knowing we were missing something, knowing that our doctrine had blinded us to a threat that didn't fit our historical models. But I didn't know what else to do. I'd written the assessments. I'd briefed leadership. I'd pushed as hard as an intelligence analyst could push within the system. September 10, 2001. I was reviewing latest intelligence summaries. Nothing unusual. The threat reporting had actually decreased. Some colleagues thought maybe we'd overestimated Al-Qaeda's capabilities. Maybe the heightened vigilance had deterred whatever they were planning. I went home that night with the same uneasy feeling I'd had for months. September 11, 2001, 8:46 a.m. I was driving into Langley when news broke on the radio. A plane had hit the World Trade Center. Initial reports suggested a small aircraft, maybe an accident. 8:03 a.m. Second plane hit the South Tower. Not an accident. I was running from the parking lot to the building when my phone rang. My division chief. Get in here now. This is it. This is what you warned about. By the time I reached the counterterrorism center, we knew. 4 planes hijacked. 2 had hit the World Trade Center. 1 had hit the Pentagon. 1 was still in the air, United 93, which would crash in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. The room was chaos. Analysts were pulling every piece of intelligence we had on Al-Qaeda. Someone was already backtracking the hijackers, who they were, how they'd entered the country, what we'd missed. I sat at my desk and pulled up my March assessment, then my June update, my August warning. Every indicator had been there. Flight training, financial transfers, timeline analysis, operational security patterns. We'd seen it coming. We just hadn't believed it. Over the next hours and days, the intelligence picture clarified. 19 hijackers, most from Saudi Arabia. They'd been in the country for months, some over a year. They'd attended flight schools, the exact schools we'd flagged. They'd received financial transfers we'd tracked. They'd communicated through networks we'd monitored. Every piece of the puzzle we'd collected individually was now assembled into a picture of the most devastating terrorist attack in American history. 2,977 people dead. The World Trade Center destroyed. The Pentagon damaged. A nation traumatized. The questions came immediately. How did we miss this? Why didn't we stop it? Who was responsible for the intelligence failure? The brutal truth was we didn't miss it, we dismissed it. We had the intelligence. We had the warnings. We had analysts across multiple agencies raising concerns. But our doctrine said it couldn't happen. Terrorists couldn't coordinate something this sophisticated inside the United States. Our defenses were too strong. The operational security required was beyond their capabilities. We'd measured Al-Qaeda by our standards, by historical precedent, by what we thought was possible. We never considered that they'd changed the game entirely. They weren't trying to match our military strength. They were exploiting vulnerabilities we didn't think we had. The 9/11 Commission would later document the intelligence failures in excruciating detail. Agencies that didn't share information. analysts who connected dots but couldn't get leadership attention, structural problems that prevented synthesis of threat information. But sitting there on September 11th, watching the South Tower collapse on CNN, I knew the deepest failure was conceptual. We couldn't imagine the threat until it materialized. Our doctrine had blinded us. The transformation of American intelligence after September 11th was total. The Department of Homeland Security was created. Intelligence sharing protocols were completely redesigned. The doctrine of the wall between intelligence and law enforcement was torn down. We created fusion centers where CIA, FBI, NSA, and other agencies worked together in real time. The lesson wasn't just about specific failures. It was about how we think about threats. After September 11th, we started taking warnings seriously even when they didn't fit historical patterns. We learned to synthesize intelligence across agencies. We accepted that adversaries could innovate faster than our doctrine could adapt. I stayed in intelligence for another 12 years. Every assessment I wrote after September 11th carried the weight of that day. I never wanted to be the analyst who dismissed a warning because it didn't fit expectations. In 2004, the 9/11 Commission interviewed hundreds of intelligence officers about the attack. The testimony was revealing. Senior officials admitted we'd been complacent. We'd assumed our defensive posture was adequate. We hadn't anticipated that a non-state actor could change the rules of engagement so effectively. One CIA officer said in testimony, "We were fighting the last war. Al-Qaeda was fighting a new one." The intelligence community that existed on September 10, 2001, was fundamentally different from the one that emerged after. We'd learned that threats don't announce themselves conveniently, that adversaries adapt, that innovation beats doctrine. My March 2001 memo sits in declassified archives now. Researchers and analysts study it alongside dozens of other warnings that preceded 9/11. It's part of the historical record of how we failed. But here's what that memo really represents. It's proof that intelligence isn't about having information. It's about believing the information you have. It's about recognizing when your doctrine is wrong before catastrophe proves it. Glenn Hinton wrote a memo about AMD that Intel ignored until it was too late. I wrote a memo about Al-Qaeda that the intelligence community filed away until 3,000 Americans were dead. The pattern is the same. When you're dominant, when you're successful, when your doctrine has worked for decades, that's when you're most vulnerable. Because you stop seeing threats that don't fit your model of how threats should look. Al-Qaeda didn't beat American intelligence with better technology or resources. They beat us by thinking differently, by exploiting assumptions we didn't know we had, by recognizing that our greatest strength, our confidence in our defensive posture, was also our greatest vulnerability. September 11, 2001, changed everything about how America approaches national security. Changed intelligence doctrine, military strategy, homeland security, foreign policy. But the deepest change was psychological. We learned that catastrophic threats can be visible and invisible at the same time. Visible in the intelligence, invisible in our doctrine. 24 years later, I still think about that March 2001 memo. About the warnings we gave. About the response we received. About whether pushing harder could have changed anything. I'll never know. But I know this. In intelligence, in military strategy, in any field where you're defending against adaptive adversaries, the moment you stop questioning your assumptions is the moment you've already lost. We weren't ready for 9/11 because we couldn't imagine it. By the time we could imagine it, it was already happening. That's the warning that matters most. Not the specific threat, not the tactical details, but the reminder that your doctrine, your assumptions, your model of how the world works, all of it can be wrong. And by the time you realize it, you're measuring the consequences in lives lost and history changed. The memo they ignored wasn't wrong. The system that ignored it was.